Okay, everyone, welcome to the second session on ICS for the stakeholder meeting. It was pointed out to me that it might be helpful for the IS members at the table to introduce themselves very quickly. So I'm Elise Liebers from the NAIC and acting chair of the FSTC.
Peter Windsor from the IAIS Secretariat.
Paolo Cadoni, chair of the Capital Solvency and Filtration Working Group, Bank of England.
Mark Kruitel from the Dutch Central Bank, member of the Financial Stability and Technical Committee.
Giovanni Cucinota, IMF.
Hi, Andreas Fluyen, Bank of England.
Matti Pelton in Federal Reserve Board.
Tom Fennell with the Federal Insurance Office at the U.S. Department of Treasury.
Ramon Calderon with the NAIC.
Manuela Zweimann for Jolla in Frankfurt, Germany.
Jonathan Dixon from the Financial Services Board in South Africa.
Clara Lindley Myers, Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance.
Damian Ewroski, Polish FSA.
Nathalie Berger, European Commission.
Good morning, Frédéric Hervaux, ACPR, France, member of the FSTC.
Hello, Alberto Corinti, Italian Insurance Supervisory Authority.
Craig Swan, Bermuda Monetary Authority.
Peter Braumüller, Austrian Financial Market Authority.
Stephen Seitz from the Federal Insurance Office at U.S. Treasury.
Keith Chapman, Australian Prudential Regulation Authority.
Sandra Schaefer, Federal Reserve.
Linda Dusick, Federal Reserve Board.
King Ili, Monetary Authority of Singapore.
Hiroshi Ota from Japan FSA.
Catherine Lezon from IAIS Secretariat.
Yoshi Kawai, IAIS Secretariat.
John Moroney, Head of Capital and Solvency at the IAIS Secretariat and Vice Chair of the Capital Field Testing and Solvency Working Group.
Urs Halbeisen, FINMA, Switzerland.
Vicky Supporter, Bank of England, and Chair of IAIS Exco.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It's also been pointed out that this session is being recorded and will be posted on the IAIS website shortly, in short order after the meeting, I suppose. So with that, I wanted to actually welcome everyone. For those of you that traveled overseas, welcome to the United States. Welcome to beautiful California and this lovely spot here in La Jolla. I wanted to thank all the stakeholders that are here and all the volunteers, the presenters for this morning's session, and I think we'll be hearing some more from all of you later this afternoon, so thank you for coming. We had a somewhat of an unusual schedule this IS meeting in that our executive committee met before the Financial Stability Committee, and the stakeholder session is stuck in between. And that actually turned out to be quite fortuitous because we got some good steering from our IAIS Executive Committee, and we get to hear from all of you before the financial FSTC goes into a meeting later today and all day tomorrow. So we're actually going to be digging in on some of the very important design characteristics of the ICS. And we're going to be reviewing in some detail the proposals that are and recommendations that are coming out of the working group. So I just would like, before I introduce the chairs and vice chairs of the working group and ask them to go through this with you, I just wanted to underscore what an important effort the ICS is to the IAIS. I think we are looking at a 6-year development period, and we're approximately 3 years through that development period. I think we've accomplished an enormous amount, and I think you'll get a sense of that today. We have, I believe, 40 volunteers participating. We hope that more of you will participate. We have over 20 jurisdictions or 20 regions represented on the working group, so we're getting a lot of perspectives. With that, I think I will turn it over to the chairs and vice chairs of this CSF working group. Also, the Secretariat will be providing part of the presentation, and we also have a representative from the Federal Reserve who will be going through some of the GAP Plus presentations as well. So with that.
Okay. I think what we propose to do is just to start, we'll give you some presentation, one related respect to the work we are doing on valuation, and both on the market-adjusted valuation, GAP Plus, and also on capital resources. So we'll start immediately with valuation on MAV, and then Peter and I will guide you through to what we're doing and where our thoughts are and what we're going to be discussing also with the Financial Stability and Technical Committee over the next few days. And you'll see that some of the things which are happening go exactly in the same direction you've been asking so far about testing more than one option on the market-adjusted valuation. And a similar thing will happen also on GAP Plus, where we'll be testing different approaches. Okay, starting, Peter.
Okay, thanks Paolo. We'll actually run through these slides fairly quickly because the key issue is to show you what we're thinking about in terms of testing of options. And as Paolo said, it might be somewhat towards what you're actually asking for from your previous comments. So there are two key aspects to discounting, how we actually construct the base yield curve and how we actually construct the spread adjustment to that base yield curve. And we're concentrating on the second of those two main issues today. Okay, so we've got the main issue to resolve at the moment is the spread adjustment. It's a critical issue to resolve as it deals with volatility, and there is an equivalent issue that you'll see later in the GAP Plus presentation about AOCI. This issue was a significant focus in 2016 field testing. We had 6 options that were tested, and they were tested on both a current market basis, as at the end of 2015, and a credit spread stress event to see how the different approaches worked. So what we think is important now is to narrow down those field testing options, and we'd like to have a maximum of 3 of those. So in terms of background, I think probably the first item needs a little bit of clarification. The MAV discounting approach is not a market-consistent valuation approach as is commonly understood. Most people think when anyone says market-consistent means risk-free discounting. That's not what's on the table here. We're talking about a market-adjusted valuation approach. So while volatility is an integral part of the risk management of insurance groups, the approach to the adjustment to the base yield curve aims to remove artificial volatility. So I'll just keep moving on. We've got 4 key components of how you might actually construct the adjustment to the base yield curve. The first is what portfolio of assets do you refer to in determining the spread adjustment, whether you actually have a differentiated approach for different kinds of liabilities through a liability bucketing approach, whether you, what level of granularity the calculation is done on a per currency basis, and the methodology of adjusting the spreads for default and other risks. So many of you will have seen slide 6 in previous presentations. It simply sets out the 6 approaches that we tested. So we did everything from risk-free, so that's at one end of the spectrum, to the asset earned rate. Those were both what we called reference methods, and we tested 3 options. One being a currency-specific representative portfolio per currency-based option, and then we had 2 options based on a weighted average based on the firm's assets. So that was sort of getting more towards recognising the actual asset portfolios of the firms on a per currency basis. In effect, what we have is there are 2 extremes, and we've talked about this in the previous session. We've got those who advocate the pure risk-free discounting approach, and those that advocate a full entity-specific sort of approach. And the range of options we tested were meant to be on various parts of that spectrum. So many of you will have seen this as well, slide 8, and it sets out some of the prudential considerations. So we're not just looking at you see up in the top right corner there, minimise volatility. So that's obviously one of the principal things that we're looking at, but there are a number of other objectives that we need to consider in terms of what will be the optimal approach to determining the spread adjustment. So what have we learned so far? We've learned that data and field testing are important, but it doesn't provide us with answers about all those different objectives that were set out in the previous slide. It's a point-in-time assessment. Overall, from what we've seen so far in 2016 field testing, that the methodologies behave as they were designed to perform. We can actually modify the results to proxy different variations. And if we actually also just look at all those qualitative key features, that doesn't by itself also give us the answer. So we find that people who are thinking that a risk-free discount rate is the appropriate way to go, they will find anything that's away from that spectrum doesn't meet their objectives. And those that are looking more towards an asset earned rate, they find that anything towards the risk-free approach doesn't meet their objectives. So what we have to do is try to bring those different views together, acknowledging that the methodologies that we tested in 2016 aren't delivering on a solution. Also acknowledging that those in the more extreme positions on that spectrum I set out before won't necessarily be able to get all the objectives that they want in a discounting approach. So we're trying to propose methodologies that can be accepted as a compromise for ICS version 1.0. So what's important on the rest of this presentation is what you're actually seeing here is a summary of the options that are actually going to be considered later today and tomorrow by the Financial Stability and Technical Committee. So the first one is what we call a blend of options. So it blends aspects of option 3 that was tested in 2016 and option 1 that was tested in 2016. So option 3, the portfolio that's referred to as the weighted average assets of a particular IAIG in a particular currency, but with the IAIS determining the spread on each of those asset classes. Option 1, the key feature there is that it had the reference portfolio was one that was based on an average of the IAIG's or the volunteer IAIG's investments in a particular currency. So the idea of the top bucket is this is to be an optional bucket for those liabilities that are less liquid, such as annuities in payment. So the idea here is that a larger proportion of the spread that's calculated on this basis would be taken into account, an 80% application ratio, and it would be based on assets specifically backing bucket 1 liabilities. And yet to be developed, but there should be criteria for the management of assets backing top bucket liabilities. The general bucket, which will be most of the liabilities we expect for most of the volunteer IOGs, this has a reduced application ratio, so only 65% of that spread that's calculated on the basis of the representative portfolio. We do have to take into account something that we have to look at is how credit spread shocks among jurisdictions sharing the same currency can be taken into account. So I think an important aspect here is we've got the general outline of these options, but a lot of the specifics do need to be fleshed out. Things like risk corrections, and for those IIGs that invest in assets that are outside the currency of their liability. So, for instance, you might have Japanese companies investing in US dollar assets. We need to work out a way to deal with that.
But in a much broader sense as well, and this applies also to the other options.
Yeah.
Please have a look at these options with an open mind, in the sense that lots of details need to still to be fleshed out and potentially corrected, including application ratios here and there. So this applies to this description, but it applies also to the next ones.
Yeah. So the next one that's being considered as an option to go forward in field testing is the own assets with guardrails. We do acknowledge that this seems to have a broad amount of support in the industry and across different geographies. So it makes sense for us to recommend to the FSTC that this be tested. The industry, we understand, is putting it forward as something that could actually replace both the GAP Plus and market adjusted valuation approach, and could be a way of converging. The industry is also suggesting that it brings together the best elements of both those frameworks. So those comments are taken directly from the feedback that we got on the ICS CD. And some of the features of this approach is, first of all, it's very much based on the asset holdings of each individual IAIG, and the proposal here is some prudential guardrails being inserted. For instance, capping the spread on lower quality assets to a BBB spread, which is similar to what we did for some of the options in field testing for 2016. Using an IAIS prescribed adjustment for default risk. Using IAIS reinvestment yield assumptions for assets whose duration are shorter than the liabilities. Including the spread, a spread earned by equities and alternative investments. Not applying a liability bucketing approach like we did with some of the options and like is proposed in that first blend of options, and 100% application ratio, so taking into account 100% of the spread calculated based on the firm's own assets.
Net to default.
Yes, net to default. Thank you, Ballard. Also, the granularity of the spread calculation could be based on the asset hypothecation. So a great deal of granularity could be included in this approach. So I won't go through all of this, as it I'll be repeating myself a little bit, but this slide analyses how the industry's proposal compares with reference method 3, which we actually tested in 2016. I'm sure in later part of this session, any of those proponents of the own assets with guardrails are welcome to elaborate on the approach. Matty.
And last but not least, the AA+. When we saw the FASB exposure draft about the updates to how liabilities are discounted, we thought, well, maybe that's something we could test, and it really serves two purposes. And one of them is to measure or assess how the convergence might work if FASB goes ahead with the proposal, convergence between GAAP+ and MAV. And the other one is, of course, how it would work as sort of another compromise option between the risk-free and the full application ratio or the own assets rate. Oh, I can turn the page. It resembles option 1 of the 2016 field testing. First, we started with the AA, or what FASB calls the high-quality fixed income instrument yield, which works reasonably well for jurisdictions where there's a high proportion of corporate bonds. But then we thought of other jurisdictions where there's more government bonds in portfolios, so that's how we arrived at the representative portfolio, so that it's not firm-specific, but it represents the average of the IIGs in that jurisdiction. And the way we do the spreads is that we then take the proportion of those average portfolios allocated into sovereign bonds, into AAA, and into AA, so that AA is the cap for the AA+, and so anything below AA rated, including also the non-fixed income, so equities, alternative investments would get also AA spread, everything except cash. Represents positive thinking because we call it AA+, because even if in terms of the spread it's really AA minus. And again, the advantages of this approach we thought of is the convergence between MAV and GAAP valuation methodologies. All of this is assuming the FASB proposal goes forward. Where it falls apart a little bit compared with FASB is FASB gives the firms a free hand to determine the discount rates once we go beyond the liquid part of the curve. And we'd like to see a little more discipline, just because that this is not firm specific, so it's very comparable between the firms. We know what the assumptions are up to the point of the last point on the liquid curve, so we'd like to see that same discipline going forward after the liquid part of the curve, so that would then be IAIS dictated yield curves all the way to the ultimate forward curve. And in terms of the ICS value principles, then we think this would promote the consistent valuation between assets and liabilities. And it would also represent comparability of outcomes across different jurisdictions. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matty. So I won't go through slide 19. It's there just as a bit of a comparison as to the different features of the proposed 3 options for field testing.
So do you want to take questions now on this part of it, or John? Oh, okay. So I guess then we'll introduce then the next presentation, which I understand is from MetLife. John, do you want to give some introduction?
Thanks so much, Elise. I'd just like to introduce Steve Belcher, who's the Vice President of Global Insurance Accounting Policy at MetLife, who will give this presentation. Steve has had 25 years in the insurance industry. The first half was with Ernst & Young, a well-known public accounting firm. Second half as a preparer with industry, including 2 years in the middle with the US FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board. His current positions outside MetLife are chair of the AICPA, Insurance Experts Panel, and also chair of the ACLI Accounting Committee. Welcome, Steve. If you can give the presentation, we very much look forward to it.
Okay.
I'll do the slides for you.
Okay.
Just nod.
And I appreciate the opportunity to present. My goal is to leave you with a better understanding as to where the ISB and the FASB and the respective insurance projects are, where the ISB is landing and where the FASB is heading. The ISB, and the next slide here is kind of a summary. The ISB first began working on a comprehensive insurance standard way back in 1997. So long ago, many accounting careers have ended since then. Some have actually started and ended during that time frame. I'm still here, which is good. But the FASB joined the ISB about 8 years ago to try to reach a global converged insurance accounting standard. The FASB already had a standard. The ISB did not have a comprehensive standard, but the FASB aimed to work to get a global standard. They worked together for many years. In 2014, however, the FASB decided to break off, and the ISB went on its own to work on a global standard, except for the U.S. And the FASB focused primarily on improving their already existing standards for short duration contracts like property casualty and then long duration contracts. So I'll start with the ISB. They're very close to issuing their final insurance contract standard. It'll be called IFRS 17 in the order. It's expected to be issued in the middle of this year with an effective date of 2021. They've determined for the discount rate, and this is primarily focusing on fixed rate type liabilities, a discount rate that reflects the characteristics of a liability. So with respect to duration, liquidity, and currency, that's kind of their principle. And the ISB over the years has issued standards in contrast to the FASB that are much more principles-based. So they don't provide specific rules as to what to do. So they provide a concept that it's a liability rate that has the characteristics, for example, of duration, liquidity, and currency, and then it provides two methods to come up with that rate. Originally, in their earlier deliberations, they only had the bottom-up approach that's listed here, the risk-free rate plus a liquidity spread. The insurance industry spoke out and said, with concerns of the practicability of actually applying this, the subjectivity of coming up with a liquidity premium. So they developed, and now the final standard will have two approaches to come up with this discount rate. And again, they're not very prescriptive as to how to construct your curves. They allow a lot of flexibility and subjectivity. But the top-down approach, we think, is probably going to be what most companies are going to employ because it's a little bit easier to follow, and that's basically taking the yield on an actual or reference portfolio of assets at the insurance company and adjusting for expected and unexpected defaults. I'm taking a principles-based standard and kind of putting it into one little box on a chart and potentially oversimplifying, but that's effectively what their method is. So again, in contrast to where the FASB is going, the FASB is focusing again on improving long-duration insurance contracts, so life and accident health type products. As you may know, the current U.S. GAAP model has locked-in assumptions, including discount rate, locked in at inception, and they're only unlocked in a situation where an entire block of business is deemed to be deficient. So in most cases, insurance liabilities for FASB and U.S. GAAP financials are locked in at the discount rate, the company's expected earned long-term investment yield at the time the contracts are issued and never change. So the FASB, again, in pretty much in line with the ISB in concept, is saying that they're going to require insurance liabilities to be discounted at a current market rate that reflects the characteristics of liability, and they've loosely defined that as a risk-free rate plus an illiquidity premium. So you can see in concept, that's really the bottom-up approach of the ISB. So in concept, I think they're trying to reach the same principle. The FASB decided that instead of providing a principle to develop that rate, that they would create a more objective, easy to calculate, easier to audit, easier to verify means of coming up with that estimate of that risk-free plus an illiquidity premium. So they developed and they came up with this concept of a high-quality fixed income instrument yield. And high quality was not something that was foreign to U.S. GAAP. That terminology, high quality, had been used in the pension accounting literature since the late 80s. When pension accounting came out, high quality fixed income instrument yield was a rate that pension plans would discount their liabilities for U.S. GAAP reporting purposes. And the SEC had come out at some point shortly after and interpreted that rate as being kind of the AA rate in the U.S. So even though the FASB doesn't say AA rate anywhere in their exposure draft, they say high quality, which has been interpreted in U.S. GAAP to be the AA rate. There's been concerns in the industry and MetLife, and I'm going to go over in a minute, as to whether the spread over the risk-free rate that the AA rate represents is appropriate for discounting insurance company liabilities. So we can go to the next slide. So MetLife issued a comment letter to the exposure draft. All the comments were due December 15th to the September 2016 exposure draft. And in that comment letter, and we'll have a link in some of the later slides, you'll see a link to that letter if you want to go to the website. We made three big observations that highlighted some analysis that we did to show that we would support something that equated more to a AA rated index, and here's the reasons why. So first, we observed and did some analysis, and I'll go into a slide in a minute in terms of the empirical data, that spreads observed from a AA rated index of bonds better aligned with spreads observed in new business pricing for fixed rate liabilities. So in general, insurers are going to price their products to achieve a desired rate of return, including considering liability payments, expenses, taxes, asset returns, capital required to support those liabilities. So we were able to take a sample of products and implicitly determine what the liability spread was based on market data, not MetLife's own products, but industry products, and determine that spread that's implicit in the pricing is much closer over the 5-year period that we look, much closer to a single A than it is to a AA, and we'll go over that in a slide in a moment. Also, the argument for the AA or the single A rated index of bonds is that it better represents an allocation of an insurer's investments. So again, not necessarily a single insurer's own investment portfolio, but looking at the aggregate investment portfolio, and in this case of the U.S. industry. So we gathered some data that ACLI had put together to look at the average investment or the credit investment portfolios of U.S. insurers, and if we just took those spreads and removed unexpected and expected defaults, we arrived at a spread to risk-free that was, again, much closer to the single A. And then finally, with insurance ratings, we wanted to try to corroborate the industry pricing and the industry development. So we took a look at industry ratings, and we have a slide afterwards to show this, but in general, the industry ratings align closer to, and this is Moody's claims paying ratings, align more closely to a single A when you look across the U.S. industry. Again, this is not just a MetLife concern. This is what we advocated in our comment letter. We think the FASB has to seriously consider whether or not they want to stick with high quality is where they're heading. There was approximately 40 comment letters on their exposure draft. Many of them came from preparers like MetLife, but there were also accounting firms and trade associations. And for those who answered the question about whether they agreed with this discount rate, the majority disagreed with the AA rate and had similar concerns and similar recommendations that MetLife has put forth. Only 2 out of the 40 actually supported the AA rate. I don't have those companies here, the names of those companies here, but there's very little support is the message on the high quality rate. We can go to the next slide. So what I wanted to show here briefly is just some of the data. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can from the back there. But what we did was again took a sample of 10-year term certain payout annuities, and someone may ask, why did you pick term certain? Those aren't insurance product. There's no mortality risk, and that's kind of precisely why we chose that, to take out some of the noise that's created. So in choosing a 10-year term certain payout annuities, they're priced very similar to life contingent annuities, but the advantage of using the term certain payout annuities is we don't get in the data the individual company's unobservable assumptions about mortality. So we were able to get kind of the benefit of looking across several different companies, implicit pricing within those products without getting noise from the mortality assumption that may be different for each company. So what we've observed is that the liability spread is sensitive to spreads associated with a broad set of investments within the typical insurance investment portfolio. So if you look and see that top line of the yellow, that's the BBB rated spread to treasuries for each of the periods. So, and the bottom line is the AA rated. And then just the lighter blue line above is the single A rate, and that kind of the jagged green line in the middle, that's the implied liability spread price in the pricing. So as you can see, for the periods presented, we think that the period from 2012 onward is more representative of the future. But you can see there is a correlation. There appears to be a correlation between the pricing and the rates that companies invest in. But you can see that the green line, the dotted green line, is much closer to the lighter blue line, which is the AA rate, and much more distant from the AA rate spread line at the bottom. So again, this is some of the evidence that we presented in our comment letter. This chart is there. You can see, if you want to see the entire comment letter, there's a link down at the bottom there where you can see the source. Okay, the next slide, this is just, as I mentioned, this slide shows the percentages of North American companies sorted by Moody's claims paying rating. So a majority of the life companies have a single A claims paying rating, with some companies a little higher, some a little lower, but the majority kind of sit in that middle area of the single A. So again, this is not conclusive by any means, but again, it just kind of corroborates the views that we're able to show with the pricing and in the investment portfolio. I wanted to make one last slide here. This is just a summary again, and this is, you can gather this from the FASB's basis for conclusions in their exposure draft. They explain why they decided on the high quality rate. They basically said they didn't want to have a rate tied to an insurance company's specific own asset rate. They wanted it to be a liability rate, which is where the ISB landed, which was not surprising. They wanted the rate to be verifiable, easily auditable, neutral in a way. So coming up with a rate that equates to an asset spread, AA, whether it ends up being AA or single A, we think it'll still meet these criteria. They wanted something consistent from period to period and consistent between companies. And also, and an overriding thing was cost benefit. They acknowledged, and they actually used this quote in their standard, no perfect discount rate. They acknowledged there isn't a perfect rate, right? They know that risk-free plus liquidity premium is where they wanted to go, but whether they picked a high quality rate or something, different, they recognize that there is not going to be a perfect rate, and so they were really focusing on the ease of operability. High quality has been in US GAAP for 30 years. It's there, it's available, and that helped to drive them toward. And they said pension liabilities are similar to insurance liabilities, so they focused on high quality. In our letter, and you can read in more detail, we actually go into a little more explanation as to why we believe that pension liabilities are should not necessarily have the same rate as insurance company liabilities, but without going into a lot of detail, that's also in our comment letter. I will mention, too, that we highlighted in our comment letter, and this maybe goes without saying, we did some field testing during the period of the recent financial crisis. So in 2008, when credit spreads widened, the single A and the AA credit spreads widened. They didn't widen in a similar fashion. So just imagine the left side of the balance sheet, we have bonds, primarily bonds that are carried at fair value with changes going to equity. And so we field tested that against the liabilities with a discount rate that is AA versus single A, and we noticed that in times of severe market dislocation, so when the spreads on the single A rate and AA rate widen, but the single A rate widens considerably more, the disconnect is very noticeable, meaning that the decrease in the asset values from the widening spreads is not matched by the liability value if you use a AA. So using a AA rate to discount your liabilities, you're not getting an equal or even a close to an equal match. In some cases, it creates significant optical view of the company's equity of very negative. So we highlighted that it could leave a stakeholder or user of financials with a kind of a false alarm that maybe the company is in financial distress when they may have a great asset liability management program and be otherwise fairly matched up from a cash flows perspective. Again, using a AA rate to discount the liabilities would significantly reduce, potentially eliminate a lot of that procyclicality that could result from using a AA rate. So that's what I have. Again, we believe the FASB will listen to comments, and we believe that they will be focusing on coming up with a discount rate that accurately reflects the risk-free rate plus an illiquidity premium. And we're confident that they will have to take a hard look at the high-quality AA rate, given all the comments that have come.
Very good. Thank you for the presentation. Next up, we have a presentation on GAP Plus. We have Tom Fennell from the Federal Insurance Office and also co-chair of the CSFWG, and Sandy Schaefer from the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank in Boston to present that part of the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Elise. Yes, I'm going to share this with Sandy, and even though he's sitting all the way over there, you'll have to trust me. We are on the same side with respect to this presentation. So gap with adjustments, our opening slide, is something that I think most people have seen quite often, but we sometimes feel necessary to remind people what it's all about. These are the principles that back the gap with adjustments approach. One of the more important items was in some respects referred to by Steve a moment ago in terms of having something that is independently verifiable, that's been supported by accounting standard setters, but also by the audit function of the firms, whether that's the external audit function and or the internal audit function, but something that many people have put their eyes on before it gets to supervisors. So that was fundamentally a major effort. The other thing I would say is that, I think this is on the next slide, the broad aspiration for GAP Plus and MAV is to eventually be comparable. There's not a meeting that goes by where we don't have at least a question about where do we stand in that regard and what are we doing and can more be done and that sort of thing. So I'm glad to address those kinds of questions, and I'll just kind of do that right now in some respect. We have a number of things going on this year. The presentation that was given on MAV, my colleague Maddie's comments about the AA approach in MAV, I think what Steve was just describing about where the FASB and ISB are, that is driving some of this conversation. Inherent in the GAP Plus approach is that we are using local jurisdictional gaps, and it's not just two options. It's not just US GAAP, and it's not just IFRS. Within IFRS, there's numerous different local gaps because currently there is really no effective single standard. So countries, even within the EU, use their local jurisdictional gap for that purpose. Under IFRS 17, I want to say when, and hopefully not just if, when that comes out, that will change that. It won't change automatically because it takes a while to implement any new accounting standard, but the implications of that change would be pretty dramatic on some of the objectives that we have here at the IAIS in terms of what we're trying to do in valuation. It would create a more uniform framework as a beginning starting point, whether it's for MAV or GAP Plus, and something we'll have to pay attention to. And likewise, and I think it's obvious from Steve's comments that the same is true with the US FASB. The changes that they will make, we have to pay attention to, and that provides, I would say, some promise on a longer-term basis for convergence. On a shorter-term basis, we are already engaged in some dialogues between the MAV and GAP work streams in this regard. It kind of reflects, I think, some of the comments we received in the consultation to the effect that, gee, why don't you have some sort of a compromise on an approach to discounting? Because, as noted early this morning, that is the largest share of the difference between the two, and that is correct. So we are having that conversation, and that's sort of a separate conversation that might have a shorter-term implication in terms of field testing and how we proceed, but that's ongoing. So in 2016, as this slide suggests, I mean, our objectives were pretty simple, but to determine that GAP Plus was developed and as a fair means to get to a meaningful capital ratio in its own right. While convergence is a good objective, I mean, we have to have something that works by itself first. And so that was part of our major objectives for this year. We really focus on two different aspects. They're kind of the keys to the ICS ratio. So one is the numerator, and that's the impact of valuation on capital resources. So that was our primary focus, and what we've accomplished through data analysis and reporting up to the working group and to FSTC to date. The other is going to be on capital requirements, the denominator of the ICS ratio. That work on the capital, I should say the data analysis is still ongoing. We have some work actually next week we'll be doing in Basel in that regard, but that's equally important. And I think of the two of these, the immediate, call it light at the end of the tunnel, is on the numerator side, the valuation side. The capital requirement side is still a piece that I think will have some longer term work that we'll have to explore. The outcomes this year were not dramatically different from last year. This is our second year. I would say as you move from GAP to MAV to GAP Plus, we see convergence. And what we also see is, as someone noted this morning, is that where there is difference between MAV and GAP Plus, that major difference is by far the impact of discounting. So we continue to see that. We do have some outliers, and that's the type of thing we continue to explore for purposes of enhancing the specifications. There were some other issues that are noted here, definition of contract boundaries, and surprising to me anyway, the different understandings of unearned premium. I never would have thought that would be very different, but we do find some instances of that. So I think that's where I'm going to stop and turn it over to Sandy.
Thanks, Tom. So I have a few slides here just on some of the highlights or key points in GAP Plus, just to give people some background as to the work that we're doing. One of which is referred to as the AOCI adjustment. And similar to MAV and working with the spread in the discount curve, to try to address undue volatility in capital resources. Under GAP Plus and specifically under the US GAAP version of GAP Plus, we have this AOCI adjustment that is attempting to do something similar to address the accounting asymmetry that exists today in the US GAAP Plus example, plus perhaps a few other jurisdictions where the accounting under GAP Plus is similar. So essentially you have the assets backing the liabilities that are marked to market, and then for the mostly long-term life liabilities, the way that the valuation works under GAP Plus, you have essentially a book yield that adjusts very slowly, plus a reinvestment rate. And so you get movement on the asset side while the liability side is somewhat locked in or delayed. And so in order to address that, we've identified AOCI, which in this context, AOCI represents unrealized gains and losses on debt securities that are backing long-term liabilities. And so we look to adjust that amount out of capital resources in order to create that symmetry again between assets and liabilities, so that the volatility that is not expected to be realized is removed from the balance sheet. So we, in 2016, attempted to create or develop a definition for that and tried to at least get started in terms of having volunteers provide some figures around that, and we will continue to be testing that. We just sort of took the first step in trying to define it, and then we're going to in 2017 make some further refinements to it, while also keeping an eye on what's going on in the accounting and the changes that are coming that the FASB has proposed, and that was talked about a little earlier, and I'll get into that in a future slide. So this just gives you a sense of the scope for this AOCI adjustment. So we have these sort of three buckets currently that it just in terms of simplicity to try to describe the different GAP Plus jurisdictional examples. So as you see here, you have, I'm going to start at the bottom there, so you have the US and Hong Kong that are currently applying a similar approach where you've got a book yield and assets at market, so there's an AOCI adjustment there. There are other jurisdictions where it's kind of a blend between a book yield and then there's also a statutory component that is layered in, and so there is the potential for an AOCI adjustment also in some other jurisdictions that you see in the middle. And then at the top, these jurisdictions, the EU, South Africa, other Asian jurisdictions where it's more of a market-based approach, very similar to the way that MAV works today, and there would be no need for an AOCI adjustment for those jurisdictions. So I think Tom covered a lot of this slide, as well as I think some of the background was also provided by Steve in the last presentation. So what we've come to the conclusion, or maybe it's an obvious conclusion, that discounting is driving the differences between GAP Plus and MAV, and also differences between different GAP Plus jurisdictions. And as we in GAP Plus are tied to systems, processes, and amounts that are subject to audit, we're tied to the GAAP accounting rules. And so with the IFRS 17 coming up shortly, and the FASB proposing an exposure draft that would change the accounting for much of the life liabilities, we're going to have to think about what we do in terms of GAP Plus moving forward. Before we do that, we actually have to have a standard come out, and so we're going to have to sort of think about what the impact would be. And one of the ways that we are thinking about this impact is, as Maddie described, using an AA plus approach, which would perhaps help us to evaluate what GAP Plus would look like under the new rules that are coming out, and specifically from the FASB. And an added benefit to that, I guess you could say, is that MAV will also be testing that approach. So we'll have the AA plus approach of discounting being looked at in terms of a reference method for GAP Plus, and also in terms of MAV, and so we can help. That will help us to try to isolate some of the other differences, perhaps, in the valuation approaches between GAP Plus and MAV. So going forward in ICS version 1.0, what we plan to do is a lot of this is sort of status quo in the sense that we're going to be moving forward with the 2016 field testing specifications in most instances. We are looking at certain incremental enhancements to those that are based on comments that we received in the consultation document, as well as some of the things that we've identified in field testing that require some additional refinements. So I have those listed at the end, and you can look at those on your own. It's not a comprehensive, you can go back, Tom, I'm not finished on the other one. So it's on the next slide. You can see some of those. Those aren't an all-inclusive list of the type of the adjustments, but those are the types of things that we're looking at. In terms of discounting, we are looking to further refine discounting and how that works. Today we have most of the discounting rules are based largely on either GAAP as it currently exists, or GAAP and a mix of GAAP and STAT depending on the type of jurisdiction. And we're going to take another look at those to determine whether we need to address some of the things that Maddie had described in the AA plus approach, where to the extent that there is looking out at the illiquid end of the curve and where management judgment is applied, we may consider adopting or defining some, call them prudential enhancements or guardrails around how that end of the curve is determined. The AA plus approach, and what was the last one? Sorry, Tom. I had one more. Sorry. Oh, okay, and this is another piece of it. So, so last year we tested a macro stressed balance sheet under the MAV approach, and we feel that it's also important to be able to get that perspective in GAAP Plus. It's important both in terms of how the AOCI adjustment will work in a stressed scenario, and also to evaluate how discounting moves relative to a shock like that. So we're going to be looking at a balance sheet both in a stressed environment and for the current period. Thanks. So again, this is just a laundry list. I put it there just for information purposes. This will give you a sense of some of the things that are changing. They are incremental in nature. And if you have any specific questions for me or for Tom, you can either contact us via email, or you can catch us during a break or something like that. That's it for me.
Good, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Sandy. The next presentation will be done by John Maroney on capital resources, and I think we'll move the lunch break back a bit to start at 1 to 2, so that John can finish his presentation, and then we can take some Q&A.
Thanks very much, Elise, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be sharing this section with Tom Fennell. We're the two vice chairs of the Capital Solvency and Field Testing Working Group. So we spend a lot of time together at these sort of meetings in Basel and other places. Capital resources has been a key issue for us to be looking at over the past couple of years, and this is the first time we've effectively brought material up to Financial Stability and Technical Committee that is ready for potential decisions this month, next month, before the timeline planned of getting version 1 agreed in June. But it is a very big, important issue, and lots of interest from the audience here today and in many other places. Given time, even with the extra extension that Elise has mentioned of an extra half hour before we break for lunch at 1, and we will make sure we keep some time for Jeff to return to the top of the Q&A section. We'll go through just the first 3 of these items in a bit of detail and leave the rest there for the record. All these slides are on the website, so I'm hoping that people have found them there. So we are certainly keen to get further input today and beyond. As I said, they're very sort of important and key issues. The first one is the issue of structural versus contractual subordination. The way we framed the issue for Parent Committee to consider today and tomorrow is, should the Tier 2 qualifying criteria be modified in order to recognise senior debt and the characteristics of regulatory regimes that enforce structural subordination? There's 2 options we've put forward, which are summarised there. The first option is maintain the approach from the 2016 field testing, And the second option is structural subordination that's enforced by insurance supervisors should be recognised in the Tier 2 criteria. So they're the two options that are on the table. Here's a diagram that, for those unfamiliar with structural subordination, gives a picture of where a holding company in the middle, the top middle of that circle, is raising debt, senior debt from external investors. That debt is then invested downstream to insurance subsidiaries where it becomes equity and clearly a capital resource of the insurance subsidiary, and that before any dividends or repayment of that equity from the insurance subsidiary to the holding company, there is required to be supervisory approval. So that's essentially translating senior debt at the holding company level to equity and capital resource at the insurance subsidiary. So the views of those that support option 1 are summarised in the next 3 slides, and then I'll turn to Tom to summarise the views of those that support option 2. And the first area, a group of points is gathered here as recognition that structural subordination is fundamentally at odds with the concept of consolidated standard. And there's 6 points there. I'll summarise those. The first one is that in a consolidation process, all the intergroup transactions should be eliminated, including downstreaming of debt from a holding company. The second point, senior debt is a liability looking at the consolidated group and has no loss-absorbing capacity in a winding up. The third point regarding experience with established regulatory controls around structurally subordinated debt has been done on a legal entity basis, whereas ICS is intended to be a consolidated group standard, and hence there isn't a translation of experience and the legal entity level to what that implies at the group consolidated level. The fourth point is regarding supervisory approval for dividend payments only takes into account the protection of that particular subsidiary's policyholders, and it doesn't offer protection to policyholders of other insurance subsidiaries within the group. And it's not clear how it applies when the debt has been invested into a different jurisdiction. And the final point on that page is that it's difficult to actually identify clearly how much downstreaming has actually occurred in insurance subsidiaries. There hasn't been a requirement to keep those records historically. Moving to the next group of points, and this is the general point of contractual subordination is stronger and more reliable than structural subordination. The two objectives of the ICS are the protection of policyholders and also contribution to financial stability. Senior debt isn't seen as fulfilling those objectives. Second point, contractual subordination more transparent and consistent. The third point, in some jurisdictions where there are regulatory controls over dividend payments, it's not clear that they are applied in all circumstances. The fourth point is level playing field with banks. Basel III has now a long history of not recognising senior debt within the way capital resources, and certainly for IAIS members that come from integrated supervisors, that's a key consideration, and for others. And the final point is that structural subordination may not be effective in situations where a holding company has other assets, as explained there. And the final slide in this group of supporting option 1, 2 areas there. Holding companies should be a source of strength rather than a drain on resources. And there's 4 points there. I won't go through those in detail, but I've just mentioned the first point about avoiding double leverage is a key area of concern, but also the acceleration clauses. And then the final one at the bottom of the point, the issue is not limited to subordination. There's other criteria in the capital resources framework regarding permanence, acceleration of repayments, supervisory approval not addressed by structural subordination. So there need to be changes to several of the criteria, and that would significantly lower the quality of capital in the capital framework for Tier 2 capital resources. So I'll now turn to Tom to go through the views of those that support option 2.
Thank you, John. I should say at the outset that although I'm the spokesperson, I really speak for the full U.S. side. We submitted a coordinated response on this topic and others involving capital resources to the Capital Working Group meeting in December in Miami. From my personal perspective, what first caught my eye about this particular issue was just understanding couple of years ago that we have substantial amounts of debt on both sides of the pond. And then the way it works out in the ICS is that if it's contractually subordinated debt, which is very commonplace in some regions, some jurisdictions, that all qualifies now as Tier 2 capital. But if it's other debt that is subject to structural subordination, which is common in our jurisdiction, perhaps some others, it does not. So when you dive into that and peel back the onion a little bit and ask why is that, what drives that, what you find is this issue of it's not a question of whether senior debt should qualify or not. It's a question of whether we should permit, in addition to contractual subordination, structural subordination. In our country, and maybe others, structural subordination is a legal construct that is as enforceable as contractual subordination. And in our case, it's used predominantly in insurance markets and recognized by insurance regulators, and we have experience with that. So it's the catch-22 for us is trying to understand why is the ICS criteria discriminating against part of the legal regime as opposed to focusing on the criteria for different instruments. So when we look at that and say, let's put structural subordination back in play and simply ask the questions about types of debt and whether they meet the criteria, what we find is that senior debt, which is used in the U.S., can wind up qualifying. Now that will require some rewording of the criteria to get there, but that's because the way the criteria is worded right now, it is to the specific exclusion of structural subordination. So I won't go through all these points because I had those introductory comments, but I think here the most important point on this slide is simply that. It's trying to properly frame the discussion and get it in the proper context. The next slide is really talking more about the mechanics of how this works. You saw earlier on in one of John's slides a diagram. This puts some words behind that. A couple points I'll simply make is that in part what that diagram purported to represent is, I'll call it structural subordination per se, which is a notion of you push down proceeds of debt, and by virtue of that, the lender does not have recourse against the subsidiary for those assets. So by definition, per se, that is structurally subordinated. But in the U.S., we also have enforcement that's provided by the state regulatory regime over that process. So that's an important element that comes into play, and this slide deals with that. The other point is our proposal, which is to include structural subordination, would give a little bit different impact in terms of the quantity that would be recognized. So under contractual subordination, it's a binary test. The instrument either passes or doesn't pass. Under our proposal for structural subordination, it's a little bit different. It depends on how much of that proceeds of that debt is pushed down. In our view, unless it's pushed down, it's not subject to structural subordination. So we think that's a reasonable posture to take in how we propose that solution to recognize structural subordination. I think I skipped a slide. I'm sorry. On this one, what we're trying to do here is address more points from the standpoint of pro, but it's also kind of dealing with some of the other issues that are raised by those who support option one and address those comments. And I'll just take one by way of example. Fungibility, is that an issue? And opponents to our proposal raised that. I would say, yeah, it is absolutely an issue, but it's also an issue for proceeds of contractually subordinated debt, which is in a insurance legal entity. It's also an issue for retained earnings, which is in insurance legal entities. So we do need an answer on fungibility, but I don't think we're going to answer it in the context of this narrow issue around structural versus contractual subordination. That requires a much more holistic approach across all the elements of capital and where they're housed within the group. So with that, you'll have these slides. You have access to them already, as I understand it, on the IAIS website. And anyway, you can get familiar with the components of the argument, both pros and cons.
Thanks, Tom. So we'll now move to issue 2, and this is the treatment of mutual internationally active insurance groups. The issue here is being framed as, should there be a carve-out in Tier 1 for financial instruments issued by mutual IAIGs? 2 examples are given there of surplus notes and kick-in. Kikin being a Japanese term for foundation funds for mutual insurers in Japan. And these both currently qualify as Tier 2 capital resources. So the option one is to maintain the current approach from 2016 field testing, and this involves concessions involving preferential treatment for instruments issued by mutual IAGs as qualifying capital resources should not be made for ICS version 1, and eligibility of financial instruments should be determined based on substance over form evaluation against the qualifying criteria that are formulated to ensure an appropriate quality of capital. And option 2 is to provide a carve-out for mutual insurers within Tier 1 Unlimited, and that would modify certain criteria for Tier 1 Unlimited in order to classify surplus notes and Kikin issued by mutuals as Tier 1 Unlimited. So that's the framing of the issue and the two options that have been put forward to FSTC. And then again, I'll present the views from members that support option 1, and Tom will do the corresponding for those that support option 2. As listed here, the points are that all financial instruments should be evaluated in a substance over form assessment against the same criteria, regardless of who issues them. And the second point is the level playing field argument, again, to avoid regulatory arbitrage. The third point, to deal with recognising there aren't impediments to mutual insurers issuing other financial instruments that would meet the criteria that are being developed. So that's an issue of any global standard won't necessarily cover everything that's currently in existence, but are market participants able to change what they're doing if the regulatory rules, when adopted in jurisdictions, reflect a new environment. Fourth point there is, would this incentivise mutual IAGs to restructure financial instruments to meet the criteria? And the final one regarding, despite regulatory controls that can defer distributions, these instruments are not effectively perpetual nor non-cumulative and do not provide going concern loss absorbency. And I'll now turn to Tom to again represent the views from those that support option 2.
Thank you, John. And again, I think the issue that raised this in the first instance was simply the concern about the inherent disadvantage that mutuals seem to have at certain times of life, particularly in times of stress when their options for raising capital might be fewer. So that was the concern we had. And while there's some information to suggest that from field testing that they're not close to reaching limits, we're field testing now in good times, and we don't really have good data to look at that shows what a really true situation, stress situation would look like for one of these mutuals. So we're concerned we might have some illogical consequences that might occur if we're stuck with limits in times of stress that reduce the amount of paid-in capital that can be counted as capital. So we're trying to really avoid that illogical outcome. We do have a carve-out proposed, in part that was agreed upon for sake of peace in the family to narrow the argument simply around a smaller population, that being the mutuals. But as you notice from the first bullet on the other slide, we're now criticized for having a carve-out. And I recognize the overall objectives for capital instruments criteria to apply to all firms, all instruments, et cetera, but you know, we got to find some middle ground here. In some respects, this third bullet gets to what I talked about earlier, in that there's aspects of the regime and supervisory discretion and restrictions that apply. Here, more so than structural subordination, these are actually built into the instrument as well, but they are important and can give really the same outcomes in terms of effective permanence, effective deferral of payment, and that sort of thing. So again, we're trying to look at substance over form and outcomes and how comparable they are, and we believe we achieve that with these notes with mutuals. And as far as the last bullet goes, it goes to the comment that we sometimes get, well, aren't there some notes that you could issue as a mutual that nonetheless already currently meet the current criteria? And I suppose there are. The issue that we have in some jurisdictions, and I would say this is true in ours, is that we have an established, significant, and stable market that has been predictable over time including through times of stress like the recent crisis that we had, which is backed up by substantial legal precedents, and we just don't think that's something that needs to be tinkered with. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Tom. And the third and final issue we'll cover off in this presentation, we'll be talking about all of them, but time doesn't allow us to go through them today, is the issue shown on the screen there of non-paid up capital. We framed the issue of should a limited amount of non-paid up capital items qualify as capital resources as Tier 2 non-paid up. Two options again, as framed there. The first one, maintain the approach from the 2016 field testing, possibly the limit of 10% mentioned there. Only paid up capital is included in an IAG's capital resource. So they're the two options. And again, briefly summarising those that support option one, that non-paid up capital items may be an important source of funding for certain types of insurers and business models, for example, mutuals in some jurisdictions, and not recognising this source of financing would create significant pressure for these groups and place them under a significant competitive disadvantage. And the second point is this approach is subject to safeguards, including requirements for supervisory approval, and payments are legally enforceable and callable on demand, which ensures that promised amounts can be available to absorb losses. So that's the arguments for option one, and Tom will cover the arguments for option two.
Yeah, our arguments for option two are really pretty simple. First one simply being that it's hard for us to understand how you can guarantee, if you will, that years into the future that counterparties will be both willing and able to pay. We understand the legal contractual responsibility to do so, but that doesn't always occur. And secondly, maybe just as important, is we just haven't seen in the work that's been done at the field test working group yet any demonstration of the need to go there for non-paid up capital. So we just don't see the need for it.
Thanks, Tom. So Elise, we'll stop this part of the presentation, pass back to you for the next stage.
Thank you very much. That's very good. Do we have, Dave Sandberg, do you have another part of your presentation? Yes? Okay.
So I recognize that there's very little discounting of time for lunch, so I will work through this quickly. Let's see, where did the clicker go? There's no... So as I said before, we had a very deliberative process and felt like we ended up in places that we didn't anticipate when we first went through the exposure draft. One of the interesting conclusions or resources we were able to draw on at the IAA was the actuaries who spent the last 20 years working on the IASB international accounting issues for insurance. They were unanimous in saying that there's a very solid framework that's been put together from an IASB standpoint that does address many of the inconsistencies and worries about the business model of insurance being reported inappropriately under alternative measures. And our conclusion was it makes a lot of sense to try and leverage out of the new accounting frameworks as opposed to trying to piece together all the implications of MOCHI, best estimates, and how they interrelate in that context. At the same time, we think it makes a lot of sense to continue the dual approach for field testing. And we walk through the issues with GAP Plus versus MAV, certainly the idea of the options and guarantees and how they fit into a GAP Plus approach is an important consideration as was mentioned. We also want to make sure we understood that the ISB risk margin has a different purpose than the IS MOCHI. They have some things in common, but the MOCHI definition is currently used in the IAS framework has a lot of interdependency depending on whether you're under GAAP, IFRS, how you think about taxes, the time horizon that you're looking at, how to account for credit market risks. This is not meant as saying, no, you shouldn't have it. It just says there's some details that need to be ironed out and put through. And from a technical standpoint, they're fairly easy to put forward once you kind of agree on the framework that you're doing. But you may end up with different definitions of MOCHI depending on which valuation context that you're using. One of the important things, too, that we kind of came to realize is that since this is really being used as a trigger for some kind of actions that should be taken either at a corporate or a regulatory level, that the time horizon is important to think about. And so liquidity is very important, market values are very important from a liquidity standpoint. Do I have the cash to cash out in the market for the cash needs that I have? On the other hand, if I have bad experience for insurance, I'm basically needing to pay those claims out over a series of years in real world money. So I need to make sure I understand what is it that might actually have to be paid when. And then there's a separate issue, which is the volatility of long-term guarantees and how do I think about that. So there are three distinct kinds of measurements that are important for the resolution, recovery, or sustainable management of the company. In particular, one of the reasons that the valuation question has been so challenging is assessing how to value when I have risk sharing with the policyholder. So whether they're participating products or non-guaranteed elements, as they're often referred to in the U.S., the philosophical choice is I can either say, what have I guaranteed to pay? And on a guaranteed basis, do I have the market values to pay those benefits? And so hence the value of a market value assessment. I'm basically saying I've made these promises for cash. It has elements of liquidity along with it. What is that value and what does that cost? I should, as a market participant, I should know that information, be able to understand it. At the same time, I'm going to be paying out my cash flows in a real world environment. So my other option would be to say, what are the likely cash flows I'm expected to pay on these participating products? And I'll be paying them with real world assets. At the same time, I have a measure that says, in the case of guarantees, do I have enough to pay the guarantees in these options? Those are both important pieces of information to look at. One of the other interesting implications, too, in this question, I think it helps raise, is thinking about validating the model that's used for discounting. We've avoided the discussion on internal models for a later topic, but it's interesting that I can calibrate market value numbers and have an objective market value framework for today, but I'm in a sense projecting cash flows that I will never see in the real world. So there's some issues about long-term model validation that are more difficult in a market value context. On the other hand, in the real world, there's this discussion about what appropriate spread. There's some uncertainty about how we define the spread. On the other hand, I will see every year what I actually paid out and have the ability to calibrate and understand how significant any issues may be in the modeling. Lastly is the whether you're looking at capital and after-tax or before-tax method. It's much simpler to do capital on a pre-tax method, but it also misses some key elements. So again, thinking about what's the most appropriate way to do that. Maybe I don't want to collapse that into a single capital number, but I want to calculate capital on an aggregate basis on a pre-tax basis and then go through stress testing or company reporting analysis to understand the tax impact for that. Then the last thing that we kind of focused on in the responses is how would we identify successful version 1.0? And we could see that by if it allowed us to look at the next steps for 2.0 in understanding how do we best link this number that is being calculated with the resolution and other tools that will be needed, such as stress testing, some kind of actuarial function or reporting on the economic status of the company and the new accounting methods. Any standardized framework is going to have holes in it, as you're going to have some trade-off between accuracy and materiality. And the question is, who's going to own that? Is that individual supervisors? Is that companies reporting? Is that something that comes out of the ORSA? Is it something that comes out as a specified responsibility of someone to be saying, what is it that we're missing in this framework so that it's sustainable over the long run? Whatever factors are used, how appropriate are they? How quickly do they change in an emerging world? Once you do that, then the successful 1.0 would then say, okay, we now understand these measurements allow us to think about the actions that might be taken either by the regulator or by the firm, whether it's rate increases, and this goes back to the bubbles that we talked about earlier this morning. Lastly, I think Vicki said earlier today we are at an inflection point. I mean, there is a lot of change within both political and economic jurisdictions, and that change is accelerating. And I think from an actuarial perspective, we're always trying to look at how do I ensure that this is sustainable in a future stressed environment that has uncertainty to it. And we think that that this idea of making sure we link the structure and the tools to the ability to change and adapt it is going to be an important aspect as well. With the last slide is that because by doing so, we can then affect both regulatory and corporate behavior. At the end of the day, if we're able to transition more to principled governance, creating a transparency of dialogue is going to make us more effective, allow us to increase the speed to understand if something has been done materially wrong, because we do need to get numbers done. We need to have comparisons, but we need to be clear about what might be the shortcomings and how can we quickly make sure to correct those.
Okay, Dave, thank you. Maybe we'll start the Q&A now, and Jeff will give you first up.
Thank you. Jeff Alton from CNA. And so I guess I'm going to kind of reverse this thing and go back to the morning session. We were talking about general items, even though I'm very interested in the items that have already been discussed. So let me start with my general items. And I think that it'd be helpful to bring up an issue that I think a lot of people around this room have been working on recently, and it really is meant to also address, I think, a point that Yoshi had made early on, always goes back to Yoshi, with respect to George. And that is, at this point, since we've got a lot of issues with respect to valuation and with the ICS, what about an alternative approach? And then with respect to this alternative approach, I think most people in this room over the last 72 hours have spent quite a bit of time looking at the covered agreement. And I think with respect to the covered agreement, it really kind of gives an interesting perspective as a potential way forward. And what I mean by that is that, I mean, I think that a lot of us in this room have been working on this for a very long time, have got almost a religious belief with respect to what the appropriate way forward is with respect to valuation and a capital structure. But what was demonstrated in the covered agreement is, well, maybe that's not really the case, that in certain situations, such as in that covered agreement, there was discussion where the U.S. could develop a group capital requirement that they felt fit. There's no requirement around what's in the group capital requirement. There's no requirement with respect to valuation. And so I think there was an issue that was been brought up quite a while ago, which and everybody can roll their eyes now, make reference to mutual recognition in a previous consultation draft that talks about my favorite paragraph 30. And so from my perspective, I view that as probably the most politically acceptable and practical way forward, and that is that the ICS is principles-based, as we've laid out, very much like the covered agreement, and with the handling of group capital in the U.S. And so from our perspective, we'd like the IAIS to continue talking about mutual recognition, aka paragraph 30 from a consultation draft many moons ago. We view that as probably the most practical way forward, and will address a lot of the issues that are currently in front of the IAIS. And just to be clear as what I mean by mutual recognition approach, a principles-based approach, the IAIS could develop, further flush out the ICS principles, and then every jurisdiction would develop a group capital requirement and would receive mutual recognition if they adhered to those principles. And so from my perspective, that's very similar, maybe not quite as specific as what's in the covered agreement, that gives full latitude to the U.S. to develop a group capital requirement. A lot of the participants who worked on the covered agreement are around this table. So I don't think any of these, so it really kind of demonstrates that in the right time, in the right place, we can compromise. And so from my perspective, under general matters, I would say that Yoshi, if you want an alternative approach, look to the covered agreement, and mutual recognition is it. So I don't know if anybody has any comments or questions or wants to make threats to my life, but those are my comments. Questions? No. All right. Moving on. Senior debt. It's a significant issue in the U.S. From our perspective, it is a deal breaker and needs to be included with respect to the development of an ICS long term. If the IAIS continues along this route, from our perspective, it should be considered consistently with subordinated debt and with surplus notes. There are no difference between the two. They should be included not only as Tier 2 capital, but as Tier 1 capital. I think I've made a presentation a number of years ago, and I really want to bring that up now with respect to how practical the ICS is. I mean, I think when I heard the presentations that were just given a moment ago, I feel that we're living in this kind of academic world that probably wouldn't be too practical when we actually had to implement it with respect to the discussion of permanence and what's in Tier 1 capital and what's in Tier 2 capital. I mean, one of the major concerns that I've had for quite a while is under periods of stress, and I think that's the most important time that you need to look at this ICS, that an IIG is going to have virtually no ability to basically right the ship under periods of stress. I mean, the way that I look at the current document, which I think the current document is, the only ability that we have to do is to go out and issue common stock. Well, in periods of stress, that is the exact wrong time to go out and say, I'm going to raise a bunch of capital and issue a lot more stock. Because, for one thing, the risk takers, which are the counterparties that we want to transfer some of this risk to, wants to be compromised. And they want an interest-sensitive contract that really represents the risk that we're transferring to them. Now, whether that's subordinated debt or senior debt, historically, that's how it's happened. Without such an instrument, the new purchasers of senior debt are going to drive down the price of common stock, which is going to give us almost no ability to raise additional capital, making the demise of the company almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so, from our perspective, you need to consider other alternatives with respect to capital and available capital for an insurance group. And that includes not only common stock, that includes not only subordinated debt, senior debt, and also surplus notes. Without it, the ICS is going to be, the demise of the company is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I don't know if any questions on that topic.
Don't appear to be any, Jeff, but maybe, did you have other issues? Because I'm sure a lot of other...
Nope, I'm done.
Okay. All right.
Good afternoon, Philip Carson of the American Insurance Association. AIA, the U.S. AIA, is a 150-year-old trade association of property casualty insurers. So my comments are going to be focused more on issues and concerns that our property casualty members have with the development of ICS. No surprise, with respect to ICS, there's been significant concern expressed by our members regarding senior debt, which Jeff was just talking about, surplus notes, and also an issue that's relatively new to us, although I did see it buried in the last consultation, but it deals with the repurchase of shares and how IAIS is proposing to treat that. It should be no surprise that we're very concerned that IAIS would take a position that would exclude certain forms of capital raising, such as senior debt and surplus notes. These are valid and acceptable mechanisms for raising capital in a cost-effective, efficient manner. And so we don't understand why there should ever be a cause for IAIS to take a position that would discriminate against one market versus another and say, no, we'll only look at certain types of capital raising and exclude others for purposes of the ICS. Senior debt, as has already been explained, is yes, is debt at the parent company, but it is held by the insurance company to support the activities, the insurance activities of the insurance subsidiaries. It is available to meet the needs of the policyholders, and therefore becomes a permanent source of capital with respect to those policyholders, and it cannot be accessed by the debt holders of the parent unless it is distributed up. But as Tom was explaining under structural subordination, that cannot readily happen without regulatory approval. So again, we don't see why there should be a distinction made between a structural subordination situation versus a contractual subordination situation. We don't think there should be any distinction in that regard. Related to this issue is the share buyback program, which again, perplexes us and surprises us that IAIS should be bringing this up. And that is the notion that companies may engage in repurchases of their own common shares, and therefore, I guess, raise the concern of permanence of that equity. And therefore, it is our understanding that IAIS is suggesting that the entire common equity base then should be disqualified for inclusion in the ICS. Now, that is not the understanding. We'd like clarification on that, but that has raised significant concerns among our members. If you were talking about just the Treasury piece, the piece that was required and not treating that as capital, that makes sense. But in terms of the rest of common, that to us does not make any sense. And then, of course, the surplus notes issue. You've heard a lot of comments on that. That is the only reasonable way for mutual companies to raise capital. And to exclude that essentially says, well, if you're going to evaluate capital sufficiency, but then exclude your own ability of raising capital, again, you have an inherent conflict. It doesn't make sense. These are tools that are used effectively in the U.S. There are ample controls, regulatory controls around the use of these tools. So our position is you should recognize these tools that are used in the U.S. because they are effective and they are controlled, and therefore there should be no reason to discriminate against them from the ICS perspective. And so from that perspective, again, with a lot of discussion with our members, we have concerns that you're ignoring a valid tool in the U.S., and to the extent that the IAIS continues to go forward with the ICS that excludes the use of senior debt, that excludes the use of surplus notes, that would also incorporate invalidation of common stock because of share purchases, that leads us with no result, no recourse, but to question why continue participating in the development of ICS. And not only why should our members participate, but why should volunteers in field testing continue to participate? Why should our regulators who work with IAIS continue to participate? And so from that perspective, we'll have no choice but to look to our leadership, look to our political leadership and regulators to address these concerns, and if necessary, remove themselves from the development of ICS, because frankly, you cannot have a global ICS if you don't have the U.S. involved. We're the largest insurance market. It has to be involved, and if you continue to exclude these important points, then we really have no recourse. And so that's our concern. You'll continue to hear that concern until it's addressed.
Thanks, Phil. Can I just make one point of clarification? The current criteria and the current field testing do recognise surplus notes as a Tier 2 capital resource. So they're not excluded. They are recognised and counted as a Tier 2 capital resource.
Thanks, John. Yes, I did see that in the consultation it was treated as Tier 2. So there is the issue of why discriminate and treat it as Tier 2, because we consider it a valid capital raising mechanism that has permanence, and so we would treat it as Tier 1.
Okay, thank you very much. Others?
Good afternoon, everybody. Steve Brody from the Property Casualty Insurers Association. We're a United States Association of Property Casualty Insurance Companies, nearly 1,000 insurers, writing over a third of the market. And our members are companies of all sizes, shapes, and forms, including global reinsurers, global insurers, mutuals, small stock companies, so just about everybody. And I want to be very brief and a little bit general, and also commenting in particular on the capital resources issues that have just been discussed. We strongly agree with the other U.S. representatives that changes need to be made in the treatment of debt that is effectively subordinated to policyholders, surplus notes, and the other issues that have been raised in the capital resources context. More generally, it seems to us that the ICS should not be, and I know that this is not something that you're seeking to do, but the ICS should not be creating winners and losers to the extent possible. It should not be changing insurers' business practices where those business practices have been successful over a long period of time and have not had harmful effects on solvency or financial stability. And it should not be changing jurisdictional regulatory practices that have had the same effect. We all know that there are issues regarding comparability and things like that, and we understand where you're going with that, but we think that unnecessary changes in systems that work well now and where change will have unintended consequences that none of us can predict need to be avoided. And that to the extent the ICS creates these things, and to the extent that it does create winners and losers and does attempt to change business practices, its global acceptability is going to be compromised. So with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Okay, it's almost 1 o'clock. Did you have some quick comments that you wanted to make, or? I'd like to do the lunch break, but if you have any quick comments.
If I could, very quickly, I'll keep them very brief. My name is Robert Neal with the American Council of Life Insurers. We represent 300 member companies operating in the U.S. and abroad, representing 90% of the U.S. life, disability income, long-term care, and life reinsurance industry. And we do appreciate, I would like to first state that we appreciate these opportunities and thank Chair Supporta and Yoshi for taking the time to engage with stakeholders. We know it's significant work and you're all away from your families for additional time, so we do find them valuable and appreciate it. And we will be submitting comments on the stakeholder engagement plan as well at the end of the week. We also you've heard from a number of our member companies and fellow trades, so I'll try not to reiterate too much that has already been said. We agree in particular with the JIFIA comments. We're an active member of the Global Federation of Insurance Associations and appreciate the ABI's lead role in our capital work stream and support statements that were made previously by Elisa. But we do want to reiterate that the importance of taking the time to come up with an end product that's fit for purpose, and we know that's been said before, but that's certainly a critical point. We believe from the U.S. life insurance industry that's particularly impacted that further work is needed to address the redundant layers of conservatism included in the ICS. Left unaddressed, they will give rise to a framework that will far exceed its targeted calibration level and could negatively impact the U.S. life insurance market, product offerings, and associated long-term investment. Our members continue to believe that the ICS framework doesn't sufficiently capture the economics of the long-term life insurance business. The exploration of multiple approaches to various design elements, such as valuation, are appreciated, and further changes are warranted to sufficiently account for the heterogeneity of insurance markets around the globe. It's important to continue to consider and test alternative approaches to key elements of the ICS, such as valuation and stress structure and calibration, ongoing. And in particular, our members support continued exploration of the gap with adjustments approach. So will not belabor it, but we do look forward to continuing to work with you, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. So, Liz, yeah. Yoshi.
Very briefly, I know that it's before lunch, but I just want to say one word about Jeff's comment, mutual recognition. We make it clear what we are doing here. It's not make a mutual recognition of Solvency II US system or Japanese system, whatever, with setting a high principle idea. This is not at all the goal that we have set. We make it clear that IAIS is a body to make a global, consistent regulation, supervision, and promote effective supervision. Our ambition is not the common denominator of mutual recognition. Vicky made it extremely clear we have not changed anything version 2 from around 3 years' time. We have an implementable, real impact ICS version 2. We are committed, regulators around the world are committed to create version 2. What we discussed, do you remember 2013 at the Taipei's annual conference? We have nothing. We have nothing ICS. You remember I explained clearly that now we can see the goal, we can see the top of the mountain, and we see these 3 years we have achieved tremendously. At that time, we have nothing, but today's discussion clearly signals that we have few options of valuation, and we have few very fundamental discussion of capital resources issues. Our ambition 2019 of version 1 is totally clear. We have one single discount issue that Hugh mentioned is a critical important, and also our ambition is totally clear. These capital resources, we have a common understanding of capital resources 2019 version 2. And this is possible because for last 3 years, we have a huge achievement, and we have still 3 more years to achieve this version 2. So just make it very practical and concrete. We have to achieve, and regulators are very committed, and we very much appreciate your engagement and also your support of this version 2. So the journey continues as we are doing now, and we are sure to achieve version 2 in 2019. Thanks.
Thank you, Yoshi. So Liz, what I'm thinking is if we break for lunch, and after lunch we can start with the ICPs and ComFrame, and we think we could finish that a little early, I hope, and then we could come back to questions on this topic, and then you would be first up. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. So we'll break for lunch. It's a little after 1, and we'll take an hour break. And please be back promptly at 2. Thanks.